Welcome to the HC Commodities Podcast, a podcast dedicated to the commodities sector and the people within it. I'm your host, Paul Chapman. This podcast is produced by HC Group, a global search firm dedicated to the commodities sector. Today we're joined by the award-winning author Mark Kurlansky, whose books such as The Big Oyster, Paper, Salt and Cod tell us how commodities have shaped history and how they've shaped the present day. Mark shares his views on the books and how they fit in with the current world, his views and philosophy on free trade and how that might be in jeopardy, and what his future books might be. We had a little technical difficulty, so the audio is not quite up to the usual standard, but I hope you enjoy nonetheless. And as always, please do leave us a positive review on the platform you're listening on, or simply follow or give us a like on YouTube or Spotify, as it really does enable us to continue to grow the show and get great guests. And as always, I hope you enjoy the episode. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
You're well known to our audience. You're a prolific author and journalist, and obviously many of the books you've written, or the ones we're talking about here specifically, have been dedicated to commodities and using them as a lens to tell history, but also human behavior and so on. And I guess when you read the corpus, you get both the sense that how commodities have shaped the world and how actually how the nature of what commodities are important has changed over time. But I guess it just seems that they are, if you take salt for example, that has absolutely defined how humanity has decided to spread itself around the world, right? I mean, can you just give us some sense of, I guess, why you chose to use commodities as a lens to talk about the world, and give us some sense of how powerful they are in determining even locations?
Well, I mean, let's just talk about trade, because that's what commodities are really about. And trade defines the world. I mean, as we're about to see, the entire world being disrupted because trade patterns are being disrupted. The relations between nations, peace and war, and everything else is directly related to trading commodities. We are involved with other countries to the extent to which we buy and sell commodities with them. It's something really fundamental to international relations, and always has been. So that when you look at something like salt, you go back to a period before the Industrial Revolution. Trade was mainly about food, and food by and large couldn't be traded unless it was salted. So you didn't have international trade unless you had salt. So you didn't have an international economy. So you didn't have a very large economy at all if you didn't have salt. That's how fundamental it was. Of course, today, you could have a very good economy without salt because we can refrigerate food and because we trade a lot of commodities besides food.
Yeah, and I guess, talking about sort of, and we'll come on to that, and kind of one of the central theses of I guess this podcast in some ways has been that the global commodity trade has been foundational to cooperation and creating some of the institutions that have set
Absolutely.
up how countries, right? And we and there's we think about cod and cod wars recently and how the EU effectively stopped that. But before we move on to kind of the competition for resources, you think about, not only has salt defined where towns that end in wich, right, are based on sort of near salt pans or whatever it might have been, but also talking about commodities roles in discovery, from obviously cod and driving
Right.
the discovery of North America, but also then you think about kind of the modern Middle East, and ventures there in the UAE. Sort of that whole region has been at the center of global commodity trade, right? Or, different trades, pearls and cloth and so forth. But it's fascinating how much the world is shaped by both current but also historical commodity trading.
Yeah, and if you just look at different periods in history, like if you look at the Crusades opened up Europe and the Middle East to each other's products and each other's markets. People rarely look at the Crusades in that way, but the whole relationship started with the Crusades and learning about these things from the Crusades.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I guess, you move on to the competition for those resources. So at the same time, they've been this force for connectivity. They've also been, at the center, obviously, of competition leading to a war, whether that's at the tribal level, at the state level, and so forth.
Yeah,
You know,
I mean that's that's an interesting issue also, because there's two things that can happen with trade. It can be competition, which leads to war, or it can be international cooperation. I mean, the whole idea of free trade was for international cooperation, that things would be manufactured in Mexico and the Mexican manufacturers would buy components from America, and everybody makes money. That was the whole idea of free trade. Controversial, not always accepted, but I think it's a pretty solid argument that it's better than competing and having, hostile relations rather than cooperative relations.
yeah, yeah, and you know, one of the things I
I
guess
mean,
most
I don't know if you want to talk about tariffs, but
yeah, well, I think this is the complication, right? Obviously, this is very topical, and we can, you can feel free to say what you
right,
want, right? There is obviously, there's the economic argument for free trade, and obviously, when it comes to commodities, it's quite easy because some commodities just aren't present in some locations where they are in others, right? And that's true of
right,
salt, that's true of cod, that's true of oysters, you know, and therefore that necessitates trade. There has always
right.
been throughout history, and let's use the Cod Wars as an example, right, where there isn't free trade in. So the Cod Wars, well, maybe you can describe the genesis of those, and fundamentally, that's where kind of free trade comes a bit of awry when if it comes down to, and we're facing that today with mechanized fleets. They're allowed within a certain radius of your country. That's very impactful on local
Well,
fishermen.
well, yeah. I mean, when you're talking about natural resources and who gets to take them and who gets to profit by them, then you get into the whole history of Africa. The Cod Wars were about Iceland becoming independent, and then do the fisheries profit Iceland or they profit Europe? An issue that all came about from Icelandic independence. When you talk about fisheries, nobody's very, very big on international cooperation in terms of taking fish. In terms of trading fish, they are. I mean, the fish trade has become this huge international thing, which is also right now being very disrupted by tariffs. And if you talk to people in the fish trade, which I do from time to time, I mean, they're really trying to figure this out right now because the whole relationship has changed.
Yeah. Do you, you've obviously built long relationships and much of your work's focused on global trade. Like, what is your view on the tariffs? Is this, to me, well, I mean, I'm an advocate for free trade, basically, and believe that the market solves things a lot more efficiently than government distortions. And obviously, the
Right.
world that we've created over the last 20 years, 30 years has been predicated on ever more free trade and globalization. Have we felt the full effects
Yeah.
of the tariffs? Is this just, what's going on?
No, we haven't felt the full effects yet, and we haven't. Producers have not, I mean, not just producers, consumers, everyone. It's not yet figured out how they're going to deal with it. The Canadian government is considering, funding exporters so that, basically covering the tariffs for them. The question with tariffs is who pays and who gets the money. And the way the U.S. government has it set up right now, everybody is supposed to pay and the U.S. government gets all the money. The U.S. consumers don't. The U.S. consumers pay for the tariffs.
Yeah, I mean, 100%, that's how they work. And not only do you, and you're also dealing with the uncertainty about whether the tariffs will be there or not, which is causing a lot of,
Right.
absolute disruption itself, right? And we see that in
Right.
the and commodity traders have to date been able to manage it to some extent. That over time, your ability to do that is going to diminish.
Yeah, and beyond that is the whole issue of international relations. I mean, the whole relationship between the United States and Canada, which has been a fairly happy one, has been based on free trade and not on competition. Relations with Mexico, which for a variety of historic reasons have been always very difficult, have greatly improved in the past 30, 40 years because of trade. And what will happen
Yeah.
now, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and yeah, and on the big sweep of history, right? We've seen this in United States history, we've seen this globally as well. You have periods of increasing government intervention in markets and periods of decreasing. There is a bit of a pendulum swinging between free trade and mercantilism, and usually there are kind of shocks either end that cause a reverse.
Yeah, and there's this tie-in between nationalism and opposing imports, which is a historic thing that's gone on forever. I was researching something recently. I realized Richard III tried to stop imports to England, which is very detrimental to the place of England in Europe, and was undone as soon as he was undone.
Mm.
Uh,
Was this the wool? Was
but
this the wool trade? He tried to stop importing. What was it? Was it wool or was it grain? I can't remember.
both, everything. He made an exception for books because he was friendly with a guy named William Caxton, who was the first English printer and depended on books from France. And so he said, okay, well, you can bring in the French books. But just about everything else he tried to stop.
Yeah, and it ended up with him being under a car park, so not didn't
Right.
work too well. I mean, one of the things there that is fascinating and has been raised by a few people when you take that nationalism piece to this, and the unintended consequences, or perhaps the starkly intended consequences of the energy transition, is from China's point of view, and Europe as well, is that they no longer become dependent on foreign hydrocarbons, right? And more broadly, in an energy transition world, the energy is made locally, on your rooftop,
Yeah.
or in a nuclear power plant next door, and solar and wind and so forth. And actually, that could create a starkly different world to the one where everyone kind of has to get on, because if the oil doesn't flow, the spice doesn't flow, it all starts to fall apart quite quickly.
Yeah. But if you look at the history of oil, you could not really argue that it's brought peace to the world.
Yeah, fair. It just sort of
I
it
mean,
does
and,
seem with that.
one of the political problems with all this is a belief that if you are buying something from a foreign country, you're taking jobs away locally. In most cases, this isn't true, but it's widely believed, and it's great political fodder for nationalists. The truth is that the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, probably did not take jobs away from the U.S. There was some manufacturing that had been going on in the U.S. and moved to Mexico, but it probably would have moved to Mexico without the trade accord. With the trade accord, the U.S. was supplying these manufacturers. It's just, I'm sorry, free trade works. You know?
We had Edward Chancellor on the podcast highlighting the fact that actually what's caused sort of the incredible inequality and essentially sort of zombification or financialization of GM and GE and so forth, or in particular, has been ultra low interest rates. And actually, that's what's created sort of the imbalance between assets and labor, and also
Right.
has meant that these companies have been far better off buying their own stock and having taken on lots of low cost debt than they have actually
Right.
been working on products.
Right. But if you just look at the issue of labor or environmental issues, also for that matter, you can bring this up in an issue you're buying from a country that is not treating workers fairly, that is not taking care of the environment. But by trading with them, you are putting yourself in a better position to get them to do something about it. If you
Yeah,
boycott their goods, you have nothing to say about what they do.
yeah, yeah. We're seeing that sort of play out. Just I guess the sort of, you've kind of got this commodities in, if I think about the broad body of work, right? You've got how commodities define with the modern age today, right? Where our towns and cities are, what, the various wealth of each nation, each country to a certain extent, right? Their natural resource endowment, and, whether they had lots of coasts, so they had to rely on trade in the case of the UK. fascinating that sort of there's that piece in the competition and trade. Then there's also and again, you've actually highlighted the distinction between trade and resource extraction, because on the resource extraction side,
Yeah,
it's got a pretty dark history when you think about kind of what New York did to its oyster beds, what happened
right.
to Wales, right? And can you just talk a little bit about that? And I guess specifically, do you feel more optimistic today than you did 20 years ago, I guess, or when as to how we're treating those resources?
I felt more optimistic 10 years ago. I feel in complete despair today. I mean, if you look at fisheries, for example, I mean, fisheries is such a complicated thing. People don't realize it. People think that, it's overfishing, and if you just get those fishermen to stop taking all that fish, everything would be fine. But the truth is that climate change has caused incredible changes in the ocean and in the food web and what's there, and there's actually some species that have profited by climate change and others that have declined. And so if you're in the business of managing a fishery, you got to figure out what this means 5 years from now, and it's almost impossible to do. So it's a far more complicated thing than just being conservative on how we use resources.
The energy and resources sector is experiencing unprecedented change. To help navigate this change and capture its opportunities, HC Group launched Enco Insights, a global advisory network dedicated to the sector, providing senior advisors and subject matter experts to investment and infrastructure funds, law firms, and corporates. Enco Insights leverages HC Group's 20 years of connections in energy and commodities to give clients the expertise they need when the stakes are high and insight matters. Learn more at encoinsights.com.
It also has the sort of the tragedy of the commons element as well, right? Which is sort of at the same time
Yes.
there's this the competition to be the last person type of thing. One of the later books, Paper, which is, as you start off in the book, paper is a technology at the same time as being a commodity, which is different to oysters and cod and salt in that sense.
Right. It's
And
not a natural resource.
yeah, and this is where I guess where
So
one of the
the nice thing about that is that anybody can have paper. You can always find something to grind up into fibers and make paper with it.
yeah. And it is what's sort of powerful about you having done so much thinking about paper and written its history, which I highly recommend to people, is of course, can you just tell us about the technology fallacy, and I'd love to get your thoughts on what that means for AI, because I think we're at another sort of inventing paper moment, or perhaps we're sort of you can tie up the internet and AI all together kind of thing. But what is the technology fallacy, and how does it relate to paper? And then I'd like to talk about AI.
The fallacy is that technology, as they like to say, is taking over. I mean, I suppose it takes over, but it doesn't eliminate. The idea that, look at ebooks, for example. When ebooks first came out, everybody said, oh, that's it for books. Everybody's going to get to ebooks and books are going to be gone. And then it turns out that some people like ebooks and some people like regular books, and that some people like both. They take an ebook on an airplane but read a regular book at home. Technology at its best expands the possibilities. It doesn't limit them.
Hmm. There's also this idea with paper where you write in the book, like, you kind of have this idea that, oh, China invented paper 2000 years ago, then the Arabs have it, and eventually the sort of the Europeans had it, and it was as though like the first European to pick up a piece of paper was like, wow, this is amazing, let's use it. And I guess the way that you use that fallacy in your book as well is to say, actually, the Arabs had paper, everyone had access, there was relatively known about thing, but the Arabs adopted it when they went deeply into mathematics, and obviously the way the Islam went in terms of scholarship and so forth. It required just lots
Right.
of paper, and it was only when sort of the Europeans got to, well, after the Crusades and all that transfer of information and knowledge came back to Europe, and at the same time you had sort of the
They didn't.
Renaissance.
They didn't need it.
Exactly, they didn't need it, right?
Hardly anybody read. What really turned things around, speaking of technology, was printing, because printing meant that you could put out a lot of material And that meant you had to have a less expensive material. I mean, you couldn't do massive printing on parchment or vellum, not enough animals around. So the advent of printing is when Europeans really first got interested in paper, and when they got interested in reading, because all of a sudden they're producing all these books. And I mean, the biggest library in Europe in the Renaissance was in the Vatican, and it was pathetic compared to the libraries in the Arab world, because the Arabs needed paper because they were doing all these things. And when Europeans started doing those things, a lot of which they adapted from the Arabs, like mathematics, they too needed paper. So, a technology that isn't needed doesn't go anywhere.
Yeah.
If you look at the history of inventors, inventors have some winners and some losers. The losers are the things that nobody wants. I wrote a book about Clarence Birdseye, who developed the
Braising
modern
fish,
industrial
freezing cod.
frozen food process, and he had lots of other inventions, most of which didn't take off. My favorite of which was he invented this fishing reel, where if you get a bite from the fish, you push this button and whoo, up it goes. Nobody wanted that. It wasn't any fun.
Yeah. And then that's kind of the bit where I guess where it got me thinking about AI, which is, you could argue the same thing, right? There were plenty, the last 10 years, I think, I've been shown lots of large language models and all the rest of it. It's ChatGPT kind of comes along, and it's a confluence of actually, it's needed today in certain fields, right? Because there's just so much information out there, so much data, it's hard to find, along comes a pretty simple tool that synthesizes things, or indeed, actually, let's talk about useful things. You can now draft a legal document, and your lawyer will tell you shouldn't, and it's a terrible. You can sort of this guild-like knowledge out there about it has to be structured this way to be admissible. Suddenly, ChatGPT unlocks loads of those capabilities where we've been paying people lots of money for sort of rote memorization and sort of esoteric skills. So I can see circumstances where the technology is needed and it actually unlocks lots of human potential. And I'm quite bullish and positive about that change. And I think there are other bits where people are saying at the same time, it's kind of like the blockchain bit where it's such a great technology, it should change, we should use it in everything. And in the end, no, apart from Bitcoin and a couple of other things, we haven't really used it at all.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's something that it's great for some things, but it's overused. It's used for things where it doesn't work well. I'll give you an example: translation. AI translations are terrible. I mean, I often do things where I'm translating French. I'm fluent in French, but sometimes there's something I'm stuck on, or I sort of want another opinion about it, and I'll go online to the translation, and whoa, no, this is just completely off.
Yeah, I don't think my Spanish is good enough to really know the difference at the moment. But what other commodities are you drawn to at the moment? Are there any other books in the works? Like, what are the stories I guess you wish you told but you haven't yet?
Well, I have a book coming out next year about lobsters, which is almost a personal thing to me because I'm from New England and worked on commercial lobster boats when I was a kid.
Is it true? My wife tries to tell me that they used to serve prisoners in New England used to basically riot over the fact that they were given lobster because it was sort of seen as a cheap and terrible food. Is that myth or true?
That is not true. And it's also sometimes said about salmon, but that also is not true. And what happened was, after these things became scarce, these stories were made up from 100 years before to illustrate a point. But this is all supposed to be taking place in Massachusetts, which has always been meticulous about recording all its laws and statutes, and there's no such thing on the books.
That's somewhat of a shame. So tell us about lobsters.
Well, lobsters, they had their ups and downs. Right now, they are the most commercially successful fishery in the United States and in Canada, way ahead of any finfish. And so, of course, the question, anybody who deals with fisheries knows that if something is looking good, you got to look out for it being bad, turning bad in the future. That's how it always seems to work. So there's a lot of questions about what the future of lobsters is, and why it's so booming now. I mean, part of the reason it's booming is that there's so little cod. Cod used to eat a lot of lobsters. It was talking about if cod comes back. If cod comes back, that would be sort of bad news for lobsters. But unfortunately, cod isn't coming back. I mean, there's if you just look at the North Atlantic, there's just this huge change from fish to crustaceans.
Because of temperature change?
Yeah, largely because of temperature change and because of changes in the food web, which are also to some degree about temperature change, and also chemical change. The oceans are less salty and more acidic, and there's all sorts of things going on, and we don't know where all this is leading. So, scientists can't really say for sure why lobsters are booming right now. And there's lots of theories on why, and there are certain things you can point to, but no serious scientist can say with certainty what this is all about. And you also can't say how long it will last or what it means for the future. And, you just go back to Darwin, and when species diminish, it affects other species. When species expand, it affects other species. It's all interrelated and has almost unpredictable changes.
Mm. Mm. One of the sort of the themes as well of your book, and you mentioned at the start, is kind of like the long tail of some of these commodities, right? And salt now had a bit of a resurgence since the nadir of the 1970s, where people are getting more interested in quality salt. Paper obviously has, I think you say in the book, right, there's been a gradual decline in paper, and there have been fewer and fewer traders and merchants of it. But actually, if you can become one of the last merchants of some of these commodities, it
Right.
can be quite. I think one of the paper trader in the book says there'll be 4 of us left, but we'll do just great.
Right, which is why that won't happen, because there's more than 4 people thinking about that plan.
Yeah.
And paper has a lot of things. What was that movie about? The guy who exposed, I think it was Clinton, for spying on people, and he was run out of the country, and they did a movie about this.
Was this the guy with?
I'm not thinking of his name right now.
Was this post 9/11 the guy who did the whistle? Who got?
Yes.
Well, not Snowden, but there was another guy, the spy.
No, I think this is Snowden, isn't it?
Yeah. Snowden. Yeah, Snowden was the sort of young, slightly sort of effete and crazy NSA worker who was, by protesting the US government, gave all of our secrets to China and Russia in a sort of bizarre protest. I mean, but yeah, I can't remember what the movie was called. I'll Google it.
Yeah, but in this movie, and he knows that the government is spying on him, and all his communications are being watched and read, and he comes up with all these devices and encryptions and ways of communicating to try to outsmart the government. And at the end of the movie, you have these 2 guys sitting in a hotel room, and you know what they're doing? They're passing notes on paper.
Yeah. Well, famously, Vladimir Putin doesn't have a laptop or computer and only uses pen and paper.
Oh, really? Yeah. Well, that's a way of getting around all this stuff. I mean, paper is the safest. It's the safest communication. If you want to do something safely, don't do it on a computer.
Hello, I'm David Hunt, founder and managing director at Hyperion Search. Founded over a decade ago, Hyperion Search has helped organisations from major utilities to startups recruit their leadership teams and key individual contributors to accelerate both their growth and the energy transition. Our 3 main verticals are renewable power, energy storage, and e-mobility. The energy transition and the talent that delivers it has been our passion since day one. To find out more, visit hyperionsearch.com or listen to my Leaders in Cleantech podcast, available on all platforms.
Again, it's that interplay of, I mean, one of the things we haven't talked about at the moment is kind of the role of innovation in all of this, right? Like the sort of the life cycle of a commodity in some ways is obviously the discovery and how it it enriches some and doesn't others, the massive competition for it, but at the same time as that competition there is that the global trade and bringing people together, but they also innovation, right? The story of cod, it's sort of an inexorable rise from sort of Vikings and fishing lines, all the way through to like behemoth factory ships cruising around,
Well, fishing is a great example of how technology is sometimes not a good thing. Really, what fisheries need to do is to become more primitive and less efficient. That's a hard thing to sell.
Yeah, yeah,
Fishermen have always been focused on how can I catch the most fish. But really, the problem for a fisherman today is how can I catch a small amount of fish and earn a good living from it.
yeah. Yeah, as you say, that kind of requires that global cooperation rather than competition to pull something like that off. We are obviously, the backdrop to this at the moment, right, is obviously there's profound change going on. It's quite worrisome for people who sit in a world where free trade is a net positive and has brought people out of poverty and has also dramatically decreased the volatility in the world. Is there, I guess, sort of, what can be done to sort of win that narrative back that free trade is a positive thing? And every time we put tariffs on stuff in the tariffs typically don't work unless you are very specific circumstances about trying to get a new industry off the ground.
Well, one of my big flaws is that I tend to be an optimist. And I think how that argument will be won is that this tariff system is going to be a disaster. And everybody's going to say, no, let's stop this. Let's not do this anymore. I really think that'll happen in a painful sort of way. I think it's going to be disastrous and everybody's going to see it.
Yeah. But then the other thing that we know is that it takes a very short amount of time to undo international trust. It takes a long time to build it back up, right? And
yes, that's right. And after everybody realizes this tariff thing is bad and they want to go back to something else, it'll still take many years before you can go back to the kind of successful free trade negotiations that were going on a while ago.
Yeah, yeah. And at the same time, obviously, we're going through profound technology change because, the energy transition is a technology, not a fuel, right? A photovoltaic cell is more like paper than it is to say like it's like oil. These are technologies.
Right.
We're going through a massive change there that actually means some of the old relationships are unraveling. I mean, there's almost an argument for Russia's invasion of Ukraine is kind of one of the early ructions of a decarbonizing world, and trying to sort of consolidate and control what's left of sort of fossil fuel burning and so on.
Yeah.
That might look more sensible in 100 years' time when people look back. But it seems like there's a lot of change. You've got lots of pieces of change going on that all are impacting and affecting commodity trade flows, and that, as from your books, has a big impact on countries and how they do.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a move away from fossil fuel, and it's going to get stronger and stronger. And wind turbines, solar cells, and all of these things are going to become more important commodities of trade than fossil fuel. I think it's going to be a huge change. I don't know if it'll be quick enough to say this, but the change is going to happen.
Yeah, with kind of profound impacts.
And there again, you see the problem of short-sightedness and some people that think that they move towards renewable energy, that this is bad for the economy, it's turning away from coal and oil and all these things that people made money on. And these people who are saying this fail to see that the new stuff will create other jobs.
Yeah. And the other thing to say is, like, the other thing we know is that we'll still be using oil in 100 years, right? We're just talking how much. There's still bits of the whale are still used in very, very sensitive lubricants. They're used in perfume. It's not, like it takes. There's a long tail to these commodities. But yes, typically innovation and trade has led to an overall raising of people's incomes and all the rest of it, right? I mean, so it's
and when you talk about competition, if we let Europe and Asia dominate renewable energy products, that will be at great expense to the U.S. The U.S. will no longer be a dominant energy supplier.
Yeah.
It amazes me that they don't worry more about that.
Yeah, well, and also if you think about one of the sort of arguments that's been made in the commodities world is whoever wins kind of the energy transition, which means essentially very cheap power. If you know, okay, we solve for intermittency, there's nukes involved and so forth, but it's cheap power in a world where suddenly, rather than your sort of steel output being the greatest measure of your country's success, is going to be compute power, right? It's how many data centers and how, who's got the best AI apps and how it goes, right? That's going to dominate that, because that's actually going to be the thing that wins you, that wins in the future. And so there is a significant long-term risk that is being thought about, but obviously
Right.
the current administration is not thinking that way.
Right. If you talk to fishermen, the fishermen realize that there's a problem with fossil fuels, although they've been very reluctant to power their vessels with anything else because they just don't trust new things. Basic characteristic of fishermen, not trusting new things. But when they look at renewable energy, they don't like wind energy, because what they see in wind energy is they see a corporation building something in the ocean. What they like is solar energy, because solar energy is this thing that you don't need a big company, any individual can do it and install it themselves. Very much in line with the fisherman's mentality.
Yeah. The other thing to say is the countries that don't keep up with innovation, that sort of bet on the old commodity, if you'd like, that typically doesn't work out too well for you. Or indeed, actually, when the ones that break off from free trade or trade in general has kind of profound, right? You can see that on a micro level if you over relied on oysters, and then your oyster fields went, and or like you look at the towns in the north of England that became very rich over fishing, and then suddenly, as a consequence of 200-mile offshore bans and and technology and so forth, have become pretty challenging places these last couple of decades.
Right. And and one kind of sad thing that you see is that poor countries made the argument, you guys all got rich doing this, so now we're going to do it. The problem is that now you don't get rich from doing it.
Yeah. And actually, you're seeing sort of those technological leaps as well, right? Where, you actually the path to modernity doesn't go through, for example, in telecoms, they're not going up putting landlines in every home in Africa, right? Everyone's just gone straight to the cell phones.
Right.
And we might see the same with how, with future fuels and so on. Well, I don't.
And by the way, we don't know where all of that technology is going. I don't know what the future is of. I have a 25-year-old daughter. She lives in a world very different than mine. Almost never has the cell phone out of her hand and spends lots of time on social media. And I think a lot of that's going to change. I think increasingly people are seeing what's wrong and what's problematic about that. Already, a lot of school systems are banning cell phones. I think that in time we will look differently on some of the things that are now new technologies.
Yeah, there's a sort of a regulatory lag on some of this stuff, but as you say as well, right? I know from our kids' experience, the minute they got cell phones banned in schools was like the best thing that ever happened, right?
Oh, really?
Yeah.
They thought 100%. They thought so too.
Yeah. I think because you're all on the same level playing field, and you don't have someone distracting you, So it's.
Right.
I think it's all generally perceived as very positive in there as well. I mean, the world is certainly getting more rapid in that stuff. And you talk about books as well, right? I think I was definitely in the camp of thinking, I was actually on a charity, a foundation for a public library at the time, who were very worried about what they would do. That they make lots of their, charity, they make income by selling off used books, right? It turns out that in a library system, that books can only get checked out a certain number of times before they had to be disposed of, and you can dispose of those by selling them. And they're very worried about what would happen to libraries themselves and that income stream in particular when it came to ebooks. And yet here we are, 12 years later, and Barnes and Noble is doing better than ever. And people, as you say, do like ultimately the ebook is not as a satisfying technology and wasn't solving as many problems as people thought it would, compared to a good old book that doesn't need charging.
No, I remember once early in this game, my agent said to me, "Do you know that ebook sales increased 100% this year?" And I said, "Well, if you sold one last year and you sell two
You
this
sold
year."
two today.
And that's what happened. It got to a certain point and didn't grow beyond that.
Yeah. Well, I'm allowed one last wild card question, which is, I always thought a book that I'd like to read on is it the cochineal shell that led to all the dyes that basically kicked off the Phoenicians and meant that to wear the purple was because a purple robe
Right.
was about the most expensive dye you could get in the ancient world. Have you, just to put that bug in your ear in case you're looking for ideas?
I think somebody did a book on the color purple.
Oh, did they? Oh, I'll have to search it out. But yeah, it wouldn't stand up to a Mark Kurlansky book. I think my listeners would agree. But well, it's been a real pleasure having you on the show. And yeah, it's as you say. I mean, I certainly recommend. I think everyone's read Salt, but I really enjoyed Paper as a foray into how a technology both does and doesn't change the world, and some of the lessons there, and from an AI perspective about, it will take off if it's solving an actual problem and useful.
Right. Well, thank you. It's nice talking to you. And speaking of technology, I'm sorry that mine doesn't work.
No, yeah, to audience, we've had trouble sort of getting this together, but I really enjoyed it, and hopefully we can have you back on in a year and talk lobsters.
Yeah, I'd be very happy to.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, thanks, Mark. That's great.
Okay. Nice talking to you. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. To find out more about HC Group, our global offices, and our expertise in search within the commodities sector, please visit www.hcgroup.global.